Okay. So if we start background about your life, as you think about where you are today, how would you depict the journey that brought you to this point? That is, what are the central commitments in your life? What does your career look like? What do you consider your most significant lifetime achievement professionally?
I'm not one who not only subscribes, but let's say I'm extremely unfriendly to formalities.
Okay.
So and that's why I become extremely uncomfortable.
Oh.
So we can, how do you say it? We don't necessarily need to do this chronologically.
Okay, yeah, it's fine. It's really fine.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so I might be answering more than what you necessarily were looking for, but not in any particular order.
Okay, yeah, that's very fine.
Okay, so it's I also had wanted to have the guide on my side.
Okay.
So that I also address some of what it is that you're asking about. So let me say this. It's difficult for me to say. How is it that I am where I am today or what I am today? I think part of it is just the nature of the person that I am. And it's a nature that has given me a lot of problems, not in a bad way, but I think as you grow older and as you search, there are some truths that you come to and you come to understand. So that's one, but it was extremely difficult growing up as a child because of this nature. Maybe to say a little bit about it. Okay. I think now I can describe myself as an introvert. Okay. But I'm also an empath. In simple language or common language, people might necessarily describe you as being sensitive, but not sensitive in a way of having, sensitive about petty things, but there are things that I tend to see around me. And oftentimes it's like, oh, am I the only one seeing this, or am I the only one feeling this? If we can also talk about the other senses. So there's also, and a lot of what women have is intuition or a lot of introspection. And it was very difficult to describe this to a child, but also for a child to help one understand. So that's one. And when I say it's partly nature, and I think that is one. There are things I wish that I didn't know about or that I couldn't see, but I just happen to feel very much. Secondly, I think because necessarily of the type of upbringing that I have had, where the sense, but also the understanding of justice, the understanding of striving, the understanding and importance of values, being very paramount in how we were brought up, and not only in a sense of, what is the word, reminders, but in practice. So to exemplify, I guess growing up, both my parents worked, and they could more or less afford, as you know, Tanzania then probably it was very rare, and many families more or less just had to do with family help, if you may. But they could more or less afford to have somebody in the house to help. But what was instilled in us from a very early age is this person is not here to pick up your mess. If anything, they are only here so that there's a grown-up in the house during the time that Baba and Mama are absent from the house. So it did not take away from the chores that we had to do as children. And I was lucky, but I only realized this later because I thought this is how everybody else was brought up, that there wasn't so much of gender differentiation in our household because we had a schedule. And when it came to your turn to do stuff in the house, my parents didn't want a long discussion. Was it done or was it not done? If you protested, what you would be told is wait until you move to your own house. But this is my house and these are the rules. So we really did not have, how do you say, none of the children, whether you were male or female, could hide under the guise that maybe I cannot do this because I'm a girl or I cannot do this because I'm a boy. So that sense of equality, but also responsibility and accountability was very much ingrained from a very young age. But I think the third thing is that I was extremely lucky to be exposed to many things from a very early age in the sense of travel, but also in the sense of people that we came across with because of the work that my parents did. And hence, I guess that was the other thing. But all the time, from a very early age, inequality really, how do you say it, had a chord with me. And I would question a lot of things because I guess I was taught that people are equal. And like my father would always, growing up at a time where most African countries were more or less just achieving independence, the liberation struggles were real for those countries that were not yet independent. But the Black movement, if you may, was at its heyday. And my parents, particularly my father, being extremely politically engaged, if you may, and this is what I mean by being exposed to, how would you say it, a lot of political figures from a very early age, not necessarily people who stood up in podiums, but people who were activists in their own right, or people who were academics, who were writers, who were just thinkers, or who in one way or another were part of the liberation struggles and were persecuted because of their thought, for instance. So I think that part of that was very much, you know, the realization growing up of not only the world as you experience it, but the critique also around it. But again, with a caveat, or as I might say, as a child, you know, there are things that you don't think much of when they come across you, because if this is your milieu, you tend to think that, oh, this is how do you say it? This is the normal, if you may. Much as I also knew the other part that was also not what I experienced, you know, the feeling of being a member of different worlds. It's also something that I grew up a lot with. And I think when you are the other, you experience being the other, or you move around different worlds. I guess with the kind of nature that I have had, or that I have, there are things that you become extremely sensitive to, or that you become acute of, in a sense that maybe others are necessarily not. I'll give you one example or two.
Okay.
So I grew up in Tanzania, went to public schools, and during that time, they were good schools. And around the age of 8 or so, I moved to Nigeria. And I lived in an area that is Victoria Island that was extremely well-to-do. And when I talk about extremely well-to-do, coming from Tanzania, where disparities between those that have and those that don't have during that time was not as it is now.
Yeah.
And when I say, oh, talk of extremes, it's during those times when you had children being chauffeur driven in not something less than Mercedes-Benz or a Bentley or something of that sort. You have people living in houses where, you know, the wife has her own floor, the Sa, as the Nigerians will call him the Oga, has his own floor, and the children have their own quarters with their own help, if you may. Okay. Yeah. So we lived in this milieu, but we necessarily did not have those privileges. And then almost like 2 fences away from where we lived, because we almost lived at the edge of this location, of this neighborhood. We lived next to one of the biggest slums in West Africa. It was called Morocco Market.
Wow.
Okay. And hence, I think that phenomena, Tanzania only came to see later with something like Manzese, for instance. Okay. You know, Manzese is quite a recent phenomena. And it is nowhere near what Morocco Market is. Maybe what the situation that you have pertaining in Kenya could somehow give you an example of what Morocco Market is, not only in terms of scale, but also in terms of the physical nature of the area, the kind of infrastructure that you find or you do not find there, the type of livelihoods, you know, the phenomena of the single mother. I think for me, it came full force when I saw it in Morocco Market. And again, while in the neighborhood that we lived, probably shopping would be done for some of these people, etc. We also, you know, it wasn't always about going to downtown Lagos to the big shopping supermarkets or shopping malls that were run by some of the Lebanese and others. But there were times where we also went to Morocco Market because, what is the word? Amenities were much cheaper. And sometimes you could get things that you couldn't get in supermarkets then. A lot of what you got in the supermarkets would be things that were imported. You know, even chicken had to be imported in Nigeria. Rice was imported. And for us, you know, coming from Tanzania, it was very strange. So if you wanted to have some of, how do you say it, local foods, for instance, you would go to the market. Likewise, if you wanted to go and have your hair done, you would go to the market. There were plenty of women there who would, you know, just do your hair. So things like that. So the contrasts for me, and I think being exposed to it from a very early age certainly did leave an impression. The other story that I also want to share was I have always been, maybe 2 stories so that maybe you get a little bit of the situation, situating myself. Again, of course, as was in the case in Nigeria, I then later moved on to a European country where you have this experience of being the minority, if you may, after experiencing being the majority where who you are was never a question, but then also experiencing assumptions about what it means to be an African in a milieu where you very much are the only African. You know, I went to middle high school where grade 5 through 8, for a very long time, I was the only Black girl. I remember when I joined the school, there was a Kenyan girl who was leaving. And for pretty much the time that I was there, in those grades, I was the only one. There were a few others in the lower grades, but that's it. And this was at a time where the famine in Africa, not only in Ethiopia, but also in Western Africa, was also happening. And hence, you know, it's bad enough that you're the only one. But also, how do you say it? Having been brought up, being very aware about who you are, your cultural values, etc., then interacting with people who know very little, not only about your continent, but people whose very, if you may, shallow interactions with people of your kind is with around narratives of slavery, for instance, or of destitution, as was with the case of the famines. Now, because it was a Catholic school, some of the sisters in the school had worked in Africa. One in particular, who I was very close to because she taught comparative religion, had lived in Mali for quite a while. And so she was also aware of other values besides what the larger population in the school was aware of. But it suffices to say that it was very difficult. And I guess part of my other journey in life was the ironies in life, the unexpected in life. The only other African who later joined, I think a year later, was a South African, but who was white. Her father worked for the embassy of South Africa. And it was extremely funny how she and I would reminisce about life in Africa that was not what was portrayed in the posters that were around us in the school. And when I say the posters, it's like basically like there was an exhibition. When you left the gym, you went to the nurse's office, and all the hallways to, let's say, the main administration building and the other buildings, you just had pictures of African children full of flies. Most of them, how do you say it? They were extremely untidy because, I guess taking pictures of that sort not only sold, but it also depended on where the pictures were taken. Because if you take a picture of somebody in the Sahel, where water is scarce, of course, you're not going to have children who are washed up every time. But this was, and this was at a time where I was coming into being a young woman and adolescent. So you can understand how not only sensitive or striking it was to me. But then the solace that one would find, or that I would find, would be in this other African, the South African, who also knew of another Africa that I also could speak to. But only later, perhaps, and after visiting South Africa, you also did realize that, yes, she also might have known of a privileged South Africa and not necessarily the South Africa that other Black people know of. Like I visited also one of the slums, one of my friends that I met later on in life, her mother lived in Guguletu, which is another big slum in South Africa. All right. So this is what I'm saying. I mean, being exposed to different types of worlds, to different types of people, makes you somehow quite acute in terms of what you see, how you see, understanding or perceiving experiences a little bit differently than those who perhaps have just one, or a, how do you say it, a monolithic type of an experience. But the other thing that has also influenced me, I think, the human potential has always influenced me. And perhaps because of the kind of messages that I've always had as a child, but also as a girl child, where there are a lot of limitations placed on people, I tend to find, because of who they are, not necessarily of what they can become. And I think that this necessarily puts people in certain prisons, but also it imprisons them. And I've always been one who believes in not only unearthing, but freeing the human potential. And one of the stories that always, or one of the anecdotes that I share once in a while, was how back in Dar es Salaam, we had a neighbor. They were from the north of Tanzania. So I will not name names, but I'll just give some of their backgrounds. This woman had 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. But it was her relationship with her husband that really, really threw me off the floor. And I would go to my mother exclaiming, I just could not understand. But of course, it was the interaction that we had with her that I just could not understand. And maybe by seeing how my parents interacted, and I just, it's like, how is this, how could this be happening to her? And she still can call this man her husband. So in short, she had 3 children, 1 boy, 2 girls. Her husband worked in a medical hospital, and she was supposedly a housewife. I'm not sure if she was a teacher, but during that time, I remember that she was a stay-at-home mother very much. But I knew of them not only because they lived to the house next door, but I was suffering from a lot of allergies during that time. And, at that time in Dar es Salaam, transportation was very difficult. And so sometimes if I had to go to Muhimbili, my parents would ask the husband for me to get a ride if I had an appointment. And so you would have to go and ask what time their driver would come, because he had a private car that sometimes he did a taxi bubu with. And it would come pick him up, take him to work. And so sometimes when I have to go to their house to ask, she would tell me to go and ask him. And he would be in his bedroom, in a towel, sitting on his bed or on his bed, with papers around. I guess during that time he was studying. He was doing his graduate studies or something of that sort. But for the way that we were brought up, it was extremely inappropriate for a child to go into a grown-up's room. So she couldn't even go and ask the husband. I had to go myself. But what surprised me or floored me even more was when she came to speak to her husband, she would be on her knees, looking down, addressing the husband. And I would say to my mother, how can he pat her at night? And this is the relationship that they have. I just don't understand how, I'll be asking. And the other thing that I noted was, if she ran out of anything, she would come and ask my mother. And I'm like, but you're cooking, of course I would only say this to my mother, but you're cooking for him. It's going in his stomach. This is the father of your children. How can you not ask him these things? I mean, if there's no food in the house, who else do you tell than him? Look, we've run out of food, but she couldn't even do that. And that I thought was extremely strange. But what happened was eventually this man left. He went for his graduate studies abroad. And during that time, this woman thrived. She thrived. You cannot imagine. She began a poultry business and it was doing extremely well. Whatever income that he sent, she went and got a plot and built a house. She taught herself to drive a car. She thrived like nobody's business. And it dawned on me that sometimes it is not that people are necessarily weak or incapable, but it is the surroundings in which and the environment in which they find themselves that imprisons them, you know? And ever since I said to myself, any human potential that can help, I can help free. That is my cause. That is my cause, because I have seen somebody blossom in front of my, you know, somebody that the rest of us, the way that we were brought up with our biases and our hangups, you could very much have taken for granted or have dismissed as being, you know, she was just a village woman who was, you know, she's lucky to have been married by a medical practitioner. But my God, this woman did more than her husband ever could. And I also saw the difference when the man came, even in terms of, you know, he was somebody now that I have a vocabulary for it. I think he was also depressed in a way, because how do you spend all your time in bed, in, you know, wrapped in a towel? But I think after seeing what his wife was capable of and doing, he himself, whenever you met him outside, even when he was not going to the office, he would be smartly dressed. It was almost like an infectious kind of, how do you say it? Dose of mental attitude of, you know, of achievement. You know, I mean, I was so inspired, really. And I have, you know, I have anecdotes like this throughout my life that I could go on sharing and sharing and sharing that have really taught me so much, such that even when you now come to read some of the theory, you can either you can compare, but also you can, how do you say it? You can try also to share of the stories that don't get told as much, or that sometimes we dismiss because we have a license because of our education or because of our social status to sort of, what is the word? To sort of, you know, explain away and not necessarily investigate or analyze more deeply to understand what are the types of conditions, for example, that inhibit people from really flourishing. Yeah.
Thank you, Dada Salma. That's quite moving. Thank you. So having said that, where are we? Because you really said a lot. So can you tell me, what is your work? I mean, what drew you to your work? That you have answered already. And has your work changed in ways that has shaped by experience that is already responded to?
So I can explain a little bit more there.
All right.
Okay, because like what I said, formality gives me, how do you say, the shivers sometimes. But let me say it this way. So people tend to think that what you're trained to be is what you should do. I've never subscribed to that. And I think growing up all my life, I've always had options of 3 things that I would want to do. You know, if I'm not going to be doing this, or if I'm doing this, I would also do this. So I trained in law. I trained in law, fine, as you know, I'm saying if I could also have done literature, a combination of law and literature, I would have done that. The education system in Tanzania does not allow you to do it.
Okay.
So a little bit of where I came to be, the Faculty of Law at the University of Dar es Salaam, where you grew up, I'm sure you know, is a little bit detached. But people always find me attending most of the seminars that were done at the Institute of Development Studies or Gender Studies. So just because before things like, you know, TGNP started up, there used to be like the Women Research Documentation Center, and then they used to have those seminars. Much as I did law, I would always attend. If I knew that they were happening, I was there. To my credit, to our, how do you say it now? Good luck, if you may. While I was at university, it was closed down twice because of us being an unrowdy bunch. And during that time, a lot of women's rights organizations were just starting up again, particularly those that had women's rights, human rights, or social justice angle. And so just as they were beginning, I was fortunate enough to sort of join. because I started, for example, volunteering in TAMWA in 1989, when TAMWA itself began in 1987. And they were still at what we call the downstairs office. It was just their one room office. And I came to meet a bunch of very interesting women there, Tanzanian and non-Tanzanians. So women who were just at the prime of their life. Some of them were just, they had just graduated their first degrees or their diplomas. They had began work, most as journalists. I was extremely lucky to have met a woman of Jamaican ancestry, Sister Jamila, who was brought up and grew up in London, but felt the need to come to reclaim her African roots. So she moved to Tanzania, and she was one of the founders of TAMWA. And we spent a lot of time together in the one roomer, where initially I was also sent because my mother was in information technology, and she knew I loved to read books. And part of the reading of the books was, I was in 5th grade, we had to do book reports. And I had felt that my teacher was always on my back about how I was not reading enough. And I guess being sensitive that he probably is also saying this because he thinks that as Black people, we do not read. And, I had a nasty experience during that time such that I had to move schools because for the first time, I actually had one of the students and her colleagues call me a nigger. She couldn't even comprehend that I was African. And even if I was African-American, nobody is a nigger per se in that sense. So I decided that I would read and really read. So on the next month, I had read about 35 books, and he could not believe this. You really read, you read all of this? And again, I was infuriated. Why do I have to explain myself? You told me to read, I read. I tried to read a book every day, sometimes 2, and you're still not happy. But hence also began my close relationship with the library. And so that relationship continued. And from a very early age, I began reading on people on the margins. So during that time, I read a lot about not only African-American history, but I also read a lot about women's history, at least the very little that I could and the age that I was. I remember that when the librarian, she was called Miss Morris, a very old couple, she and her husband managed the library. And so when she always saw me coming into the library, and a lot of my lunch times, if it was cold, or if there was a sport that I did not fancy, I would rather go to the library to read. And so, she thought, or we grew quite attached to one another. And then whenever she would see me coming into the library, she would also guide me to some things of interest that I would find. And she saw that I really loved reading historical books. So the next thing that I read after African Americans was American Indians. So I read a lot of books about chiefs, but also women in American Indian history. So even before people saw the movie, I had read the book about the Pocahontas. It was not a love story then, but it was really about, and I think what appealed to me, and then gradually I moved into stories about women who persevered despite any hardships that they faced, stories about Helen Keller, I really felt was, it inspired me. How can you be deaf? How can you be dumb? How can you be blind, yet achieve what you are able to achieve during the time that, people did not have the kind of technology we have today? She really inspired me. And I think her outlook in life, her determination to go on in spite of really not only resonated with me, I always say these things feed my soul. You know, when you can tap into the energies of others who are able to achieve, you feel that your soul is also being fed, it's being enhanced, it is being nourished, if you may. And so during that time, TAMWA was, so I've fast forward, yeah? This is 1989, TAMWA has begun their documentation center. And my mother was working full-time, and she could only do this other gig, if you may, during the weekends. So because I had time in my hands, I was introduced to another or a different set of books. And this is where I now was introduced to feminist theory, because a lot of the books that were coming into the documentation center would be donations, or if women like Fatma Alu would go to meetings abroad, they would come back with these activist scholarly books. And my task was to catalog them. And so I had to, you know, it was not enough just to look behind on the cover to get the keywords. I began reading them. So I read, I devoured the books, and then I had the fortunate, I would say, the coincidence of meeting people like Sarah Longway, of women from Match Canada, who actually then came to do some training or give talks when we were in TAMWA, and later on when in TGNP, etc. So, you know, putting it, or some of them came to do research like Melinda Robbins or Susan Hirsch, etc. So if that gives you a sense of how I navigated in the world that, you know, I've done a lot of my work in. So yes, I was trained in law, but for me, it did not mean that I necessarily would be practicing. And when I decided that I did not want to practice was when TAMWA began a legal aid clinic in around 91 to 93. And I was one of the first people to woman, if you may, that legal aid clinic. And like would happen with Suwata or Taula, we did a lot of legal aid on voluntary basis. And because TAMWA necessarily worked with journalists, there would be other lawyers who came in, as well as social workers. And everything, of course, was done in a very collaborative manner. So there would be women who came in who were social welfare workers. There would be other women who came in from Suwata, who were versed in law. There would be other women who came in from other backgrounds that would provide some type of counseling to the women who came to seek for different types of advice or assistance. And one case that I remember that for me was really I don't want to say the breaking point, but I think for me, it was the light. This is when I saw what I needed to do. Was a case that involved a man who was deceased called Marjani. And this man was an engineer who worked for TANESCO. He was in 4 relationships. He was Muslim, and his relatives wanted him, or wanted the property that apparently they thought he owned, to be administered by Islamic law. Now, amongst the women that he had children with, 2 were customary unions. One was a Christian woman, and the other was a Muslim woman. But most of the women would not have met the standard under the law, where the Indian Succession Act that would have given them any chance of claiming property would have been enforced. But all of them had a relationship with this man. They had children with him, and the children took their father's name, and he had owned up to his responsibilities. And what I liked about him was that in all the families, he had given them some type of income generating activity with which they would run their life. So some of the wife had freezers or a minibus during that time in Dar es Salaam. Remember when transportation was a headache? And so the houses were independent. And yet the relatives were saying, no, but he was a Muslim, so it is his mother who would be the one inheriting. And we as family, we are happy to take care of the needs of the children. And that infuriated me because, well, he might have been Muslim, but he chose to live his life the way he chose to live his life. How do you turn him to be more pious as a Muslim than he necessarily lived himself? But secondly, he made sure that his family was provided for, whether he was alive or not. Who are you to come and dispossess his family from what he put in place that would enable them to provide for themselves? You know? And it was very clear to me that if the law was applied the way it was, this woman will have gotten nothing. What heartened me was that two of the women who were in Dar es Salaam came together and bonded because they realized that this was something, they were in this together. And so when I took them to different places to get legal advice and the type of answers that they would get, they were always together. So I think this was the time for me when I decided that it was not enough just to represent people in court when the legal system, the provisions of the law were not pro-women, were not there to how do you say it now? To serve the interests of women who find themselves in this type of relationships. And sitting in a legal aid clinic, it was very clear to me that this was the reality of most women. Okay. So that's one. The other case that also came into, or that taught me a lot, was one that involved a woman called Leah. Leah was married to a military guy. They lived near the barracks at, where's this place near the
Lugalo?
No. Near the Dar es Salaam Trade Fair.
Oh,
Kurasini. There are barracks there.
Yeah.
So Leah had been beaten up by her husband so bad that she had her her kidney bust, as well as her how is it you know how do you call it where you have the
urine bladder.
Her bladder.
Yeah, bladder.
Bust. And so she had incontinence, not because, and this happened to her when she was pregnant. And how do you say it now? Of course, we found ourselves in a situation where, because her husband was a military person, there's this thing, the only thing that could be done, he needed to be court-martialed. And because of the strong sexist tendency then in the military, the wife was his property. So, you know, the others, officers did not really understand why we were making a fuss. It was a family thing. And I remember a number of us making trips into the barracks, going to visit this woman who literally was bedridden because of the way that she had been beaten up so badly. And so this was another instance that made it very clear to me that you have to have multiple type of strategies in how you argue the law to help potential or existing victims of violence. particularly gender-based violence. You know, we are here where we are wanting to help. We were amassing ourselves in fact-finding missions, or as how do you say it, as platforms of women with different types of backgrounds trying to help, because the journalists would be publicizing and writing about this. The lawyers were trying to draft the necessary documents to prosecute this person. But then, as I said, I guess because of the nature of the person I am, it became very clear to me that we were constrained by the legal system, the way it operated and the way it was understood. So we needed to understand the intricacies within the law itself to better argue for better, not only provisions, but also for better interpretation of these provisions so that they serve those they're intended to serve. And I think this reality also came very clearly with the operation of SOSPA. Okay, so we argued for laws where now only young girls were raped, but women could not be raped. Why? Because SOSPA would address people who have, you know, who are below 18. You know, so we sort of learned the hard way, but it was very clear to me that it made no sense arguing in front of court of law for a law that did not necessarily have, how do you say it, all the ammunition that you needed to successfully prosecute. And so I decided it would be more beneficial if I concentrated in reading more about the law, but importantly, trying to make people understand the law, but applying a sociological approach to the law. And I was extremely lucky to have found some anthropologists, some who had a legal background, who also introduced me to the sociology as well as anthropology of law, which is a little bit unique, I think, in the case of Tanzania, where, you know, for most lawyers, law is just company law, law is just contract law, law is just criminal law. But the dynamics or the history of law and how it impacts power, how it impacts relationship, most lawyers are immune to those kind of subtleties. And I think being part of the women movement, it is one of the blessings that I have had in my life. And it has also helped me in the other types of work that I have done, either in organizational development work, which I do a lot. I have been doing that since 1997 when I trained for it. And I do this work mainly with grassroots organizations across East Africa. Not necessarily the big, as I call them, development intermediaries. And I guess because my preoccupation with releasing the potential. So the more grassroots the entity is, the more I become attracted to working with them. So my career is not necessarily, how do you say it, black and white in the sense of, you know, hard or clean law, but my career is, it's a blend of different specialities, of different disciplines, different practices that are aimed at enabling people. I don't want to use the word empowering people because sometimes I think it's overused, it's an overused term, but really raising consciousness and helping people recognize their own consciousness, but finding themselves being better able to interact with their environment and releasing themselves. I think, for instance, for my graduate work, I did human rights because I do believe very much in rights and freedoms. I'm somebody who does not like to be pinned down, if you may, I'm a free spirit. And I talk about myself as a spirit being bogged down by these, formalities, et cetera, I feel it constrains my spirit. And hence I would love for everybody to enjoy a spirit that is free. Mm-hmm. And one of the way of finding freedom is through having higher consciousness of the self, but also of what is around us. And people being able to make decisions, mm-hmm. exercising free will. You know how in our society that is not necessarily prized or praised. And I guess my activism, if you may, or my vocation has always been concentrated around those kind of issues or preoccupations.
I was saying, it seems you've covered the reflection on your work, mm-hmm. which entails how do you not that one, but the background of your work. You've mm-hmm. actually said your experience and personal changes as a result of your engagement in feminist mm-hmm. academic work and or activism. And you've given some examples and some kind of like concrete work that you have done personally with other women in that regard. So we can move to number 3, reflection on your work, which you have mentioned part of it. And if there's anything that you want to add, you can add. For example, how do you understand the term feminism? What has it meant to your work? Can you tell us something about your relationship with other members in your organization? And what are some of your expectations for your organization in future?
Okay, so I cannot talk about an organization because like feminisms, it's not just one.
Okay.
And also, like for me, it's very important not to be confined by space. In Tanzania, I've had a problem with that because like I said, I began in TAMWA. And then, but I began volunteering in TAL in 1989. Then I came to TGNP even before it moved to Azikiwe when we were sitting in the mat, under the mat. And, so people would always be looking at me, well, who are you? Where are you? And I used to think, I'm with a cause. I don't have to have an identity in terms of just being here or there. I can be everywhere. Aren't I the epitome of what feminism says? I subscribe to the cause. And whenever or wherever women meet to organize, to strategize, I'm there. I mean, I don't have to necessarily be only with the lawyers or I only have to be with the journalists. That was not my understanding at all. But it made people think, approach me very suspiciously. The other thing with regards to necessarily having a label, with regards to my faith, I tend to think, and I am a very spiritual person, but because of the interactions that I had with the type of women who would necessarily come to seek advice, or when I did research, because during this time too, I did research and I continue to do research. I have understood that women have their hangups. Just as culture and traditions are our hangups, the faith that we grow up with and what we are taught gives us hangups. And that we need to be free from those types of beliefs that we're ingrained with and have different interpretations or understanding. Okay, so because I was exposed to Fatima Mernissi, amongst others, who write about faith from a feminist eye, even the kind of questions that I had, or the kind of uncertainties that I had, some things I could answer, and I'm like, yeah, this is what I think. How could God love, say he created us and in this image, etc., and then say, oh, I'm for discrimination because you're a woman, I don't like you. Because if you listen to a lot of the so-called people of faith, they tend to legalize or rationalize the same. So I said, no, this cannot be. And hence, I thought that you need to reach out to women particularly who organize around faith bases. And I knew, for instance, because for me, Islamic law was understood and was one of the sources of law. To be able to challenge it, you had to have Muslim women on board. Or the label that I got, I was bringing religion into activism. But I'm saying, well, if 95% of your women have not gone to school and they are not interacting with their faith from an intellectual level, how are you going to have your sheep who will follow you? Isn't this the support system that you need? If you're going to, for instance, ask for law reform, who will legalize the law reform? Isn't the women, and that has always been the conundrum we have faced. Because when we say we want family laws, we want personal laws to be reviewed, the religious card comes up. And when the religious come, oh, you can't touch our law because it's sacrosanct, or you can't do this because God sent it the way they have sent it, etc. Okay, and as it was hard, trying to foresee and strategizing around and trying to bring women of different faiths in spaces where that they also feel and own that, oh, they are campaigning, or this is also about me and my rights, being interpreted by people you've grown up with, that you have, how do you say it? You have engaged in different activism with, and all of a sudden question marks are around, oh no, this could be a little mini Al-Qaeda, or then I don't know, we were just called conservative then, etc. So that was also difficult. But even so, it has not deterred me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
It has not deterred. For me, it makes even what I do more important and more acute. And that we also need, these are the experiences that people have to bring on. And we also need to recognize our own constraints in our own institutions, to move forward. Otherwise, it will just be as the politicians do. You get on the podium, people hear what they want to hear, nothing else changes.
Okay, thank you, Salma. I think you've gone to the relationship between feminism, scholarship, and activism, which says, how do you perceive the relationship between scholarship and activism in general and in your own work? That is like sort of covered from your explanation.
Yes, and it has not only been covered in that sense, but for me, I write. I try to write in the sense where, a lot of my experiences, I write about them and publish them, so that people also, if you've read a lot of the narratives about, for example, Muslim African women, particularly in East Africa, it's American researchers or Europeans who come to write. But I have written as a native of East Africa about some of the issues around identities, and also being very aware that Muslim women are not just all Black. You have minorities, for instance, within the Shia community. What happens to them? I have come across women from the Shia faith who have matrimonial problems, but because even the legal framework assumes that they are minorities, in terms of their social organizing, they are very cloistered. I mean, these are different dynamics that nobody talks about. But I have written about this kind of things. I have, written about, issues around child marriages or the right to education for today, using text as well as research to argue the points. And these are live examples. Maybe so one of the things that to share. My namesake, Salma, may God rest her peace. Rest her soul in peace. I met her when I began a Muslim women's virtual network called Sahiba Sisters Foundation. And she was a member of the young women who live with HIV/AIDS in Dar es Salaam. And her story was heart-wrenching. Her mother conceived her when she was very old, and hence she wanted to live the earth, if you may, knowing that her daughter was well provided for. She married her off to somebody who infected her with HIV/AIDS. okay? And she got to know after she lost her second child. So stories like this, nobody talks about. Why don't you take the girl to school so that she can rely on herself and be on her own 2 feet, rather than perpetrate the practice where women have to, what is the word? Depend on men by spreading their legs. Why is this? And this is the very same argument that I'm making for the revision of the law of inheritance, where I get a share because of me as a person, and not because of I'm the wife, so I spread my legs, or I'm the daughter, so I'm getting handouts. If you do not tell stories like this, like I say, our advocacy for me really would be pointless, because people have to recognize themselves in the kind of narratives that we write, or in the kind of the research that we write. So again, I would like to emphasize that I have taken the trouble to write not only for an academic audience, but also for the everyday audience. I have had columns in national newspapers, weekly columns, from around 2002, I believe, until after Kikwete's second term, I think, is when I sort of stopped. I tried to resume, and because initially I also wrote in English. So I said, no, if I write now, I'll only write in Kiswahili. Unfortunately, the Kiswahili editors have not been as forthcoming in allowing, us to write the way that, you want to speak in a different way about power on gender issues or gender dynamics. That is not just about women are like this and men are like that, but you interrogate power, the haves, the who have not, the decisions that are made, in the words of Chachage. Are we prostituting ourselves still in the types of economic deals that our countries are entering to? Yet, are we dispossessing our people, in terms of the land laws that we have in place, where you are telling all the foreign embassies, come to Dodoma, I will give you 100 years land lease, while a Tanzanian in a village to date cannot get an offer in a place where they were born, So we need to be asking these questions. And these essentially are about not only gender issues, but for me, this is what feminism is. Feminism, initially, when I was growing up, was about asserting yourself as a woman, the woman power, and just as men would go around, trying to make everyone believe that they're strong, etc. But I thought the same for women. But I think increasingly, I've come to understand it as a philosophy, a way of seeing and being, where equality is not just an ideology, it is a practice, it is something that is so fundamental to, and to one's essence, if you may. But to also understand how identities shape us in different ways, to understand how our environments make certain dictates on our essence, etc. So for me, feminism is, how do you say, it is an ideology, it is a tool of looking and seeing and understanding, comprehending the world. It is even a, how do you say it, a vision, if you may, of the type of world that I would like to see myself thrive in, not just live, as people say, we thrive. Huh?
Yeah. Okay. So we go to the intersection of your work with the women movement in the country and globally.
I think I've spoken a little bit to that.
Yeah, you have.
Because of my writing, or because of my activism, I have interacted, and I'm a member of many transnational women's movements